Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure for me to be here on the Berkeley campus of the University of California. I want to say how especially pleased I am. Mike Heyman's here, a longtime friend and colleague and mentor in many ways for many of us in higher education. So Mike, it's really great to see you here and to be here with me at this occasion. Now, I presume in the audience there are many people who really knew Clark Kerr very well. I cannot claim that good fortune. I once served on a committee with Clark, I'm sure a quite insignificant committee in the many things that he did, but I've always remembered him from that time. And I hope you will excuse me for just saying a very few words at the beginning about Clark Kerr, someone who has seen Clark Kerr from afar rather than close up, but I feel I really cannot give these lectures without saying at least a few words about President and Chancellor Kerr. As you can see, I really want to say just a very few words, and I'll get on to my topic. He was an extraordinary leader, a builder, and an innovator, I think as you all know. To those of us far away or not right on the California campus, the campus of the University of California, is a source of inspiration. To me, perhaps most impressive of all, he was a voice of reason, conviction, and passion at the same time. These are not characteristics that most people can keep together. But at least in my experience, he always did. And of course, he was an embodiment of moral courage and social responsibility. So he was, in short, a very unusual man. And let me say, if you could just put the next slide on, that he did have a vision. This is, people often ask if those of us in higher education, we have a vision. He had a vision. He had a vision of the University of California. He had a vision of the university in general as a public trust and what that meant. And most of all, he had, at least in my words, the vision of a university as both a special place, a special kind of place, and a special idea that animated that place. Now, if you look at the next slide, I'll explain a little bit what I mean by that. He thought of the university as a special place in the sense it's a spot where all thoughtful ideas, systems, and proposals can be thoughtfully examined and considered. And the idea behind that, which is to me perhaps the most important, is he saw the university as a nexus where the achievements, hopes, and interests of our recovered past interact with those of the present to help shape the future inheritance of the next generation. This was, to me, an inspiring idea. And what he thought of the university as both a special place and a special idea. Now, as you all know and have just heard, the Kerr Lectureship is on higher education and society. When Mike called me and said invited me to speak on this subject, both of us responded that this allows a lot of leeway. The talks were, a year and a half ahead of me, and it seemed like very easy to find something that would fit into that. However, I stewed about it quite a while to decide what I could talk about, because I presume over a long period of time, as there are many lectures in this series, that of course we hope that we'll understand more about the nature of university and society. But I said, well, what am I going to take on? So I asked myself, what issues are really animating my own concerns? What am I really focused on as I think about universities? And they were the principal themes that were animating my thinking about universities are listed up on this next slide, and they were the continuing transformation of American higher education. That, to me, is what I'm always focused on. In what way is the system transforming itself? I'm also focused, however, on the continuing evolution of the key political and cultural commitments of a liberal democracy, because I think those things are connected. The university will transform itself in part not only because of what goes on in the world of scholarship, what goes on in the world of education, but what is in fact going on in the evolution of our own political and cultural commitments in this country. So to establish the social legitimacy of the university, you always have to tie it, at least in my view, to the continuing evolution of the key political and cultural commitments of a liberal democracy, and I'll say just a very few words about that. Now the focus, those were my animating ideas. The actual focus of the lectures that I'll give this year are, first of all, are on research universities. That's what I know and that's what I've studied. There's large other parts of higher education which I'm not going to deal specifically with. So I'm going to focus on research universities in this lecture series, and I'll also focus on a set of issues which are not taking up adequate space in our national discourse. That is really key to what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to engage a set of issues which I believe should take up more verbal space in our conversations about higher education, and therefore I'm going to put aside some issues which you hear about every day, which I and many others have talked about very often. So let me tell you what the themes of my lectures this year are, and they're up here, for those of you who can see it. They are the contemporary meaning of a liberal education, the relationship of a liberal education to professional education, to the soul of the university and our liberal democracy. Those two items I really talked about at UCLA last week and will not be talking on further here today. But this week, here at Berkeley, I'll be talking about the three latter items on this list, namely moral education, ethics and scientific progress, which I'll talk about today, and the commercialization of the university's outputs. So the three lecture titles of my talks this year are Liberal Learning, Professional Education, and the Soul of the University. That I gave at UCLA last week. What I will give here today, my first lecture at Berkeley, is the University and the Ethical Dimensions of Scientific Progress. And later on in the week, I'll talk about moral education and the commercialization of the university's principal outputs, namely ideas and education. I will therefore not be examining all the standard issues that come up and are still critically important, issues that surround affirmative action, costs, access, tuition levels, the fair allocation of research costs, our portfolio of outputs and inputs, our commitments to teaching and research, etc., a whole set of issues that are really very important, but I will not be talking about those this year. So let me turn to my topic this afternoon, which is the ethical dimensions of scientific progress. The focus of my remarks are going to be on the moral anxieties generated by recent scientific achievements. I'm interested in this subject for reasons I'll tell you about in a moment. I think it's very interesting, but I also think there's something very specific about these moral anxieties for those of us in higher education. Namely, they will bring together the world of science and the world of meaning, and therefore they will bring together the disciplines of the sciences, social sciences, and humanities in a way that I'll explain in more detail. Now, the question is, I've asked myself whether the ethical issues that are coming up on the scientific frontier represent anything new, or is it just an old song being replayed with a slightly different theme? And I've decided that yes, there are some new issues. I reject the so-called yuck factor, which scientists often advance, namely people are just uncomfortable with new ideas. That's what all excitement's all about. I reject that for reasons I will talk about in a moment. And I think the new developments force us to confront new issues in moral philosophy, and I'll speak about that. As you'll see, my analysis goes through three basic phases. I discuss what I call the old component, that is anxieties that are raised by developments in science. They're very old ideas or very old types of anxieties, a relatively new kind of anxiety, and what I think of as a very new type of anxiety because of developments on the scientific frontier. If time allows, I will give an example from the issues regarding these discussions and anxieties regarding human embryonic stem cell research. I hope I have time for that. So let me launch into, with that as background, let me launch into the subject, the ethical dimensions of scientific progress. I put that up there in case any of you mind wanders off and you want to remind yourself what I'm going to be speaking about. That's it. Ethical dimensions of scientific progress. I will, in this lecture, address certain ethical challenges that not only should play a more prominent role in our national discourse, but require the attention of the nation's research universities. There are two principal reasons why these matters are of special interest to the nation's academic community. First, because the ethical issues I intend to address bring together, as I said just a few moments ago, the world of science, both with the world of meaning and our understanding of the nature of the human condition. The particular ethical challenges I will raise not only require serious conversations between scientists and others, but these discussions need to be informed by the intellectual resources and apparatus of the social sciences and the humanities. There is no better venue in our society where such conversations should begin than on the campuses of the nation's research universities. Indeed, I believe these matters should impact the teaching agenda of all institutions committed to liberal learning, and would serve, as I also noted, to help bridge the divide between the humanities, the social sciences, and the sciences. Second, these ethical issues arise from the unprecedented success of the scientific enterprise, an arena in which the nation's research universities and their faculty now play such a central role. Indeed, the faculty of the nation's research universities are not only one of the primary vehicles for the execution of publicly sponsored research, but have great influence on the nation's science policy, the broad nature of the public's research priorities, and the public's understanding of how new knowledge may be deployed. Our faculty, therefore, have a special responsibility to be leaders in the inevitable discourse that will arise on how to give our knowledge its moral resonance and greatest meaning. I will begin by trying to sketch out the general nature of the ethical issues that always accompany scientific progress and the challenge this represents for public policy in the nation's research universities. Although I will focus a great deal on biomedical science, much of what I have to say applies to other aspects of the scientific agenda. I think it is quite clear that scientific progress not only inevitably raises ethical issues in its wake, but that the ethical issues exert a significant influence on the size, scope, and nature of the scientific agenda and the very character of the scientific enterprise. Scholarship, in the end, is seldom produced as an end in itself. Its agenda is determined in large part by the preoccupations of the time. The particular ethical problems that I will be considering will not focus on the ethical lapses of individual scientists or research groups, or the ethical norms of scientific research, but on the more fundamental ethical issues that arise precisely because the scientific frontier is moving forward. It is therefore the very success of the scientific enterprise that gives rise to the ethical matters that are my primary concern. Although I consider myself a scholar, I am not a scientist in the normal meaning of the term. I must say, however, that there have been many moments when I wished I were a scientist, since it must be very satisfying to be part of one of the greatest and most creative human activities ever. Moreover, although scientists themselves often do not appreciate it, their work, which addresses the needs and hopes of so many people, is full of ethical significance and meaning. Indeed, science, and therefore scientists and their supporters, are part of a great humanitarian enterprise aimed at the relief of suffering, at the enhancement of the human condition, and a better understanding of ourselves and the natural world. While the cumulative accomplishments of science can hardly be overstated, we must acknowledge that they bring in their wake a series of more problematic issues. With each passing day, we are reminded that more science does not always lead only to more social dividends, that the scientific agenda is not always focused on the most important issues, that science cannot take the measure of all things, that the norms of science may not be adequate to ensure public accountability, and that new knowledge is not always neutral in its moral consequences. Indeed, science and the aspirations of science are social activity and are influenced, therefore, by ideologies and various conflicts of interest, since scientific activity cannot benefit everyone at the same time. Thus, in a scientific age such as our own, serious conversations and social negotiations over both means and ends between scientists and non-scientists on matters of mutual concern are extremely important and ethically significant. The important point is that scientists and non-scientists alike are part of a common moral community bound to each other by the behavior norms we've adopted to allow for the mutual flourishing of humankind. Before addressing the moral anxieties raised by recent developments on the scientific frontier, I would like to take note of a more general and pervasive partnership between anxiety, including moral anxiety on the one hand, and change. It is my view that the process of change, whether the change is economic, political, cultural, social, or scientific, is always accompanied by a certain type of moral anxiety, as we try to work out new rules regarding our mutual obligations to each other in an altered world setting. Indeed, moral anxiety can either be the result of change or the very thing that causes change to take place. Change and moral anxiety, therefore, can be expected to be constant companions in our life's journey. Moreover, in the case of liberal societies such as our own, where we are always scanning the intellectual horizon for ways to improve our situation by constructing a better set of arrangements, or in an era such as ours where the pace of scientific developments alone is producing a rising cascade of changes, it should not surprise us that we are constantly being tossed about in turbulent moral weather. Thus it is that science and scientists create ethical challenges, not so much because of their behavior, but because of their accomplishments. Indeed, as I have said, the very success of the contemporary scientific enterprise assures a continuous flow of new ethical challenges. While these ethical challenges and their associated anxieties may be difficult to deal with, they are also an indication of the success of the scientific enterprise and the importance of taking mutual obligations to each other, or ethics, seriously. My recent interest in these issues stemmed primarily from my experience as chair of the National Bioethics Advisory Commission from 1996 to 2001. During that time, I was surprised by the level of unease many felt because of certain developments on the scientific frontier. For example, I found myself trying to understand the hysteria, quaint as it now seems, that first followed the 1997 publication of the Dolly experiment, demonstrating the capacity to clone animals using somatic cell nuclear transfer techniques, and reminding us that each of our cells contains all of our DNA. What became clear in 1997 and early 97 was that the emotionally charged reaction to the Dolly experiment was conditioned primarily by images that had been created by works of science fiction, current and ancient, and certain imaginative film and video productions, as well as a certain amount of pent-up concern regarding the ultimate meaning of contemporary scientific developments. Recall that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which spawned an entire literature which keeps coming out in vast numbers, focused on a scientist who was destroyed by the person or monster he had created. And H.G. Wells' The Island of Dr. Moreau describes a painful attempt by a scientist to attain mastery over evolution. Even more sobering were only two real and too recent memories, not only of the organized state-sponsored efforts to create a super race, but by efforts here and abroad to introduce various eugenic schemes to shape the gene pool of the next generation. In retrospect, these eugenic programs were based on naive science, an even more naive notion that we could find a purely technical solution to an array of perceived social problems. Nevertheless, these collective memories and emotions help explain why the initial reaction to the Dolly experiment was widespread consternation. Even after the initial fear subsided, however, there were ongoing concerns about what effect human reproductive cloning, using the Dolly technique, would have for the human narrative in general, and in particular for the formation of our individual self-identity and our sense of self-worth. Moreover, the critics had deployed such phrases as the inviolability and dignity of each person, or the unnatural nature of the new enterprises that seemed to present dire challenges to their concept of human nature and the structure of human societies. My interest in the source of such fears was stimulated once again by the subsequent controversy over human embryonic stem cell research, which seemed to fuel the unease felt in some quarters regarding developments on the scientific frontier, particularly in the area of human genetics. In this context, I asked myself whether there is anything novel in the ethical issues and anxieties that seem to be swirling around contemporary developments on the scientific frontier. Was it true, for example, that the cumulative effects of the many startling successes generated by the ideas of the Enlightenment, with its joint and several emphases on scientific progress, individual freedom, and cultural pluralism, finally reached a point where it is more difficult to articulate the necessary conditions for human flourishing? Alternatively, are we simply witnessing the normal difficulty of adapting our lives to new and better circumstances? In other words, was anything really new in these developments? On the one hand, in its most general form, matters regarding the sometimes enigmatic and ambiguous meaning of scientific progress are as old as the written record of Western civilization. On the other hand, as I shall outline in a few moments, there are also some quite new dimensions of the issue, and some of these are especially relevant to those institutions and individuals that consider themselves part of the scientific and broadly scholarly enterprise. As I began to think about these issues, I quickly came to two conclusions. First, attributing these feelings of unease and even moral outrage regarding particular developments in the scientific frontier to ignorance or selfishness or the work of Luddites among us, or as I said before, to the yuck factor, is both an intellectual error and a policy mistake that will not serve anyone. Second, the nature of current and prospective developments in human genetics does require us to rethink or at least revisit some of our basic concepts of moral and social philosophy. In particular, we do need to appreciate the radical nature of our new discoveries in human genetics in the sense that they threaten to erase or at least significantly blur time-honored boundaries that help define the nature of the human condition. Among other things, these developments threaten to obfuscate the boundary between the human and the sacred, between the human and the natural world, as well as to redefine the nature of human possibilities and human responsibilities. Always remember, the more we control, the more responsible we are. At the very least, therefore, these developments require us to reevaluate certain central issues in moral philosophy, which center on the question of what it means to be human, how to account for the interests of future generations, and whether or not our basic humanness requires us to restrict, for example, the way our developing knowledge in human genetics is deployed. It is clear that the prospect of possessing the capacity to shape the genetic inheritance of future generations is a source of both great hope for some and great dread for others. For some, this new knowledge deepens a defining aspect of our humanity, namely the ability to control our environment. Others, however, see this knowledge as a threat to those aspects of the human condition that they feel is most precious. And in trying to build my own understanding of the anxieties and ethical tensions raised by these developments, I found it useful to think of the issue as consisting of three distinct components. They are chronological in a sense, a very old, even ancient dimension of the issue, a relatively new aspect of the issue that arises in the special context of liberal democracies, and a very new aspect of the issue that arises because of particular developments on the current biomedical frontier. Let me deal with each of these in turn in a kind of chronological order. I'll deal with the old and ancient problem first. New knowledge of the natural world and/or a new level of control over our environment has always raised at least four kinds of ethical issues, all of which are found in some of the earliest written records of Western civilization. I will briefly note the first three of these and spend a few additional moments on the fourth. The first set of ethical issues, always stimulated by scientific progress, concerns both deciding what are the ethical uses of new knowledge and who gets to make that decision. This always arises. What are the ethical uses and who gets to make that decision? Second, a set of issues makes it necessary to decide, that is, these new developments make it necessary to decide, how we are to justly allocate the inevitable gains and losses, both psychic and material, arising from changes in income, status, wealth, and a way of life that scientific progress brings. So you always have matters of social justice arising. Third set of ethical issues arises in the context of scientific progress, deciding how we will manage the undesirable side effects or the unanticipated side effects which always accompany new technologies. Those are the first three issues which come always with new knowledge. I'd like to deal at somewhat greater length with the fourth set of ethical issues that arises in this context. This is the inevitable requirement of deciding whether this new scientific knowledge fits or is consistent with the current human narrative. By the term human narrative, I refer to the revealed or constructed story that is inevitably developed by every society in order to bestow some transcendental meaning on our individual and collective efforts. These narratives arise as a response to our own mortality, to our lack of control over aspects of our situation, and to the apparent insignificance of any individual. These narratives represent an effort to assure us that we are part of something meaningful that reaches way beyond ourselves. In part, they transform our dread into our hope. It is quite clear to me that the need for narratives to sustain our individual and joint efforts is essential for the survival of human communities. Without such a coherent narrative, or with a neurotic narrative, it would be quite impossible to elicit the kind of effort and sacrifice that human communities require for their continued existence. It is a promise of myth or other constructed or revealed narratives to define our place in nature, to give us a sense of purpose, and to provide us with some moral guidance. It is these myths and narratives that make living a meaningful life possible. These narratives are not only great feats of the human imagination, but have helped human societies transform the mundane into the wonderful. Moreover, like germ cells, They can live on to connect ourselves with our efforts to both past and future generations. And indeed, these narratives, which represent our socially transmitted inheritance of behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes, combine with our genetic and epigenetic inheritance to produce a diverse set of human natures we observe in different communities. Thus, the challenge we face is deciding how to adapt our current narratives regarding the meaning of human existence in light of our new understanding and scientific knowledge of the natural world. It is quite stunning to me, I'm not a classic scholar, but nevertheless, it's quite stunning to me to realize that most of these issues are very much present, for example, in Sophocles' play Antigone, within a single poem known as Ode to Man, which I think some of you may know, occurs very close to the beginning of the play. I apologize, I don't speak either ancient or modern Greek. I've only read this in translation, but I'll give you my inferences in any case. The poem is in the voice of a shepherd on a hillside who was watching a farmer deploy a new technology below in the valley, which is what we would call agriculture. On the one hand, the shepherd expresses admiration for mankind's intelligence by noting that mankind, meaning the person down there in the valley, is, as the poem says, clever beyond hope. But on the other hand, he also mourns the passing of a way of life occasioned by the then radically new agricultural technology. In this latter respect, Sophocles' shepherd remarks with some resignation, "May he," that is the farmer, "who slashes away at the goddess Mother Earth with his plow, never share my hearth." That's the way the poem ends. And I interpret that as saying that's a way of life he can't yet come to terms with. Even more important, however, is to recall that most of our cultural traditions and the narratives that support them have two significant characteristics. First, these narratives represent the human condition as set between those matters that are, at least in a moral sense, below us, somewhat less than we are in a moral sense. This includes a natural world, which we are well motivated, we can use and exploit. Some of the key Western religions trace that idea to the first few verses in Genesis, which after God creates mankind, he says, declares himself satisfied, he gives them dominion over the fish that swim in the sea, the birds that fly in the sky, and so on. I can't quote this verbatim, but somehow there's a natural world out there, which is in a moral sense less than us, and in which we are able to exploit. On the other hand, the second general characteristic of narratives is that there's something unique about the planet Earth as compared to other celestial bodies and human beings as compared to other forms of life. So we have human beings in these narratives sandwiched between the natural world, which they can exploit, part of the world they don't understand, very often thought of as belonging to the supernatural sphere, and we're sandwiched in between. And in addition to that, there is something unique about planet Earth and something unique about human beings. Most narratives, traditional narratives, have that characteristic. Thus, any scientific development that undermines either of these two critical themes, namely the uniqueness of the planet Earth or the human condition, and our position sandwiched between those forces deemed beyond our understanding and those forces which are below us in a moral sense, is especially threatening to these traditional narratives. The inevitable question we have to face in view of our growing knowledge base is whether narratives containing such characteristics or themes are still viable in the sense of being able to inspire human efforts. Consider, for example, a psychic shock released by the work of Copernicus, Darwin, Freud, and contemporary genetics or cosmology. With Copernicus, the Earth could no longer be considered the center of the universe. It took, as you all know, many centuries for that scientific fact to become a social fact. It simply reflects the fact that it was very difficult to incorporate such ideas into the narratives that motivated human societies at that time. With Darwin, that went, in some sense, the uniqueness of the Earth was out. With Darwin, the uniqueness of human beings seemed threatened in the sense that we are now simply part of a vast evolutionary scheme along with other animals. Contemporary genetics now reaffirms this trend by pointing out that we share the same genetic code as all other living organisms. With Freud, we discovered that however unique we were not even in charge of our own minds. Now, if that's not enough, contemporary developments in astrophysics assure us that we are like a speck of dust in the universe, slowly going nowhere but obeying the laws of thermodynamics. In my view, which is undoubtedly correct, however sobering. In my view, this perspective on the origin and nature of the universe has great implications for our human narrative. For example, at least in my view, we can no longer speak easily about the meaningfulness of life. How can you speak easily about the meaningfulness of life when we are, so to speak, a speck in the universe going nowhere, even over very long time frames? We cannot really speak about the meaningful life in my view, but we can and should speak individually about how we can lead a meaningful life. Quite different from wondering about the meaning of life is wondering how we as individuals can lead a meaningful life. That is how our narrative has to change, as an example. While that's what cosmologists and astrophysicists have to tell us, others insist that human beings are more than the accidental result of genetic mutations and natural selection, and more in a moral sense than other living and non-living things, and they reject the notion that we are just milling about in a universe that has little meaning and is heading nowhere. Thus, while the continuing achievements of the scientific enterprise continue to generate change and moral anxieties, in many ways this is simply the contemporary and somewhat accelerated version of a very old problem which Sophocles had right. Now, however, let's look at the impact of these developments in a relatively new context and look at the relatively new problem, namely the context of modern liberal democracies. The mounting number of ethical challenges faced by individuals in an era of rapid change is mirrored in the special complexity of setting public policy in a morally pluralistic liberal democracy. The special challenge we face is how to resolve ethically contested issues in a liberal democracy committed to cultural pluralism. A liberal democracy is many different things, but most of us agree that it is a system committed, amongst other values, to the rule of law, democratic self-government, private property, limitations on government actions, equal protection, freedom of speech, assembly, and religion, and so on. There is, however, another characteristic of great importance that is now the source of considerable controversy, and that is the liberal notion of personal autonomy as an almost supreme value and as a source of individual self-realization. Along with this comes a fundamental commitment to the idea of moral pluralism, or to put it somewhat differently, to a rejection of moral tyranny. Indeed, a liberal democracy requires a state to show equal concern for all citizens, almost whatever their view. The historically rather startling implication of all this is that within a liberal society, a particular set of beliefs cannot occupy the moral high ground alone. That is, I think, the most essential thing for us to keep in mind, that none of us can occupy the moral high ground alone. The fact is that there are a number of very coherent, thoughtful, and even compelling approaches to moral philosophy that continue to exist side by side, are inconsistent with each other, and compete for our allegiance. The moral and political challenge in such an environment, where it is harder to be certain about moral choices or moral claims, is to define a social and political framework that allows citizens with different views to feel bound together by some type of common discourse, despite the fact that it is not quite clear what the ultimate moral basis is for respecting another person's rights and views. The important point is that as long as we enjoy free association and the capacity to think and act for ourselves, there will be value conflicts that are not due to such matters as selfishness, prejudice, ignorance, or poor reasoning. In such an environment, we should not expect our fellow citizens to always agree about complex moral and political issues. Instead, compromise and accommodation must be the norm, since we recognize and value the integrity of others who do not share all of our beliefs. In such a context, and this is what's important for public policy, in such a context, there can be no easy public policy response to complex or controversial ethical issues. The challenge of constructing morally coherent communities within liberal democracies is not a brand new problem, but given the difficulty of accommodating different moral perspectives, we have had only a few short centuries to practice at it. It is therefore still a continuing experiment. There are, of course, many additional characteristics of liberal democracies that also generate a certain level of moral anxiety. The political and social attitude that underlies a liberal society supports free thinking, assumes open futures, and is always looking for better arrangements in our economic, social, and political life. This attitude is hostile to feeling comfortable with the status quo. Indeed, for liberals, such as myself, doubt and change are really quite noble things. It is not happenstance, therefore, that the 19th century, which saw the first full flowering of liberal democracies, gave birth to the idea of permanent revolution, whether the Marxian type or the liberal variety. At the same time, those making public policy also must recognize that despite such openness to change, many people continue to look to authority and tradition for comfort in what they perceive to be an unstable and perhaps threatening environment. For a liberal like myself, change is a means of achieving greater freedom. But for others, change continues to be an omen of loss and estrangement. As a result, many people still find it difficult to sustain a liberal commitment to personal autonomy and moral pluralism, especially in a rapidly changing environment. The reality, however, is that in opting for liberal arrangements, we are also opting for a complex and anxious ethical environment. To summarize so far, during the age within which we live, science produces change, change produces anxiety and loss. Lots of scientific change produces lots of anxieties, lots of estrangement, and lots of losses. In a time of rapid scientific change, therefore, we are bound to have to navigate difficult moral landscape, to make difficult moral calculations, and to continue to search for effective ways to sustain our commitment to moral pluralism, free association, and autonomy and worth of each individual. Let me now turn finally to the really new problem faced in this regard. Undoubtedly, there are a wide variety of novel ethical problems that now confront our societies, such as the ethical implications of globalization. But the newest problem I have in mind is the truly radical nature of recent developments in human genetics. These are radical developments in the sense that many feel these discoveries require some significant change or adjustment in our human narrative as we deal with what it means to be human and how we relate to both the natural world and to each other and to future generations in a radically new context. As I have already noted, our prospective new capacity to impact more directly the human genome of future generations raises such questions as, can we define the interests of future generations? And what standing, if any, do these interests have? Must we think anew about how to define human possibilities, responsibilities, and limits? Moreover, the rising prospect of genetic engineering raises amongst other issues the fearsome specter of eugenics. In particular, many feel that the prospect of the direct alteration of particular genes will usher in a new and to them undesirable danger, namely that a new eugenics will arise not only from the potential of state control of reproductive choices, but from our enhanced ability to choose the kind of children we want. Once again, however, some of the fears in this arena derive from our accumulated emotional capital laid down by a great deal of literature and more recently by extravagantly imagined film plots. In these respects, some of you may recall that Somerset Maugham's novel, The Magician, portrays a scientist obsessed with a desire to vie with God by creating embryos, even if it requires him to sacrifice his new wife. And Capek's famous play, R.U.R., also portrays a scientist trying to play God by creating humans in a radically non-traditional manner. Recall also that a great majority of horror films feature the theme of new science falling into evil hands. In these more recent works of film and fiction, ancient themes reappear, namely that it's ethically dangerous to overstep natural human limits, or what are thought of as natural human limits, and it remains a critical challenge to determine the ethical uses of our new technologies. Contemporary developments in genetics, therefore, bring us closer and closer to what many refer to as a genesis problem. This refers, of course, to the potential we have to exert much greater control over how many people will exist, when people will come into existence, what their identities as persons will be, as well as the length and quality of their lives. Such powers raise a number of questions. For example, do these new interventions benefit or harm the people we bring into existence? Are we morally obligated to prevent the existence of those who will be seriously disabled? Would the genetic enhancement of a person's cognitive, physical, and emotional capacities above the normal level of functioning be morally objectionable or not? This latter question, for example, raises the broader ethical question of the ethical status of acts motivated by perfectionism rather than acts motivated by justice or beneficence. Finally, we need to think carefully about the impact of our notions of individual autonomy on any newly discovered genetic basis of behaviors, as well as our capacity we developed to alter the genes we pass on to the next generation. Individual autonomy is one of the key foundations of our liberal democracy. As a result, any limitations on the individual's capacity for self-realization, whether genetic or otherwise, are a matter of potential concerns. Such limitations can arise from inadequate psychological resources, inadequate financial endowments, inadequate care, discrimination, and a large variety of other sources. Clearly, our contemporary actions in both the scientific and cultural sphere will profoundly affect the evolutionary future of our own species, and therefore we must ask with increased urgency what our moral responsibilities are to future generations. It seems to many that these similar questions are arising with a new urgency, since knowledge of the probable effects of a given action or lack of action gives one a certain measure of control over these effects, and control over effects is a necessary condition for being responsible for them. Finally, in this overall context, let me reflect for a few moments on how the National Bioethics Advisory Commission dealt with the public policy issue of whether or not it was ethically justifiable to sponsor research that involves creating and then employing human embryonic stem cells. This matter brought to the fore the area of deepest moral divide in American political life, the abortion debate. The issues that surround this debate include what some believe to be the sacred nature of the process of reproduction, and more specifically the moral status of both the fertilized ova and the early embryo. In the U.S., the first public policy concern in this area was not whether such research creating and utilizing human embryonic cells, stem cells, would be legal, but whether the United States government itself should, from an ethical perspective, sponsor research that might involve the destruction of very early embryos. The first question to ask is whether or not embryonic stem cell research raises any ethical issues. If this question can be answered in the affirmative, if it does raise ethical issues, the next question is this a public policy issue? Since not all ethical issues are obviously issues of public policy. So to begin with, does this activity raise any ethical issues? Well, this has been so widely reported, I don't want to spend much time on the details of human embryonic stem cell research, but it's quite easy for all of us to see that in order to create embryonic stem cells, we need to destroy an embryo. Destroying an embryo, if that is legitimate, depends directly on what you believe to be the moral status of the embryo. If the moral status of the embryo is the same as the moral status of a person, destroying an embryo is out of the question, no matter what scientific progress is involved. We do not sacrifice people without their consent for the benefits of scientific progress, no matter what that progress is. And of course, an embryo, thinking about consent in terms of an embryo is something we can't even quite contemplate. So that's on the one side of it. The other side of it is, yes, one could say that the early embryo has some kind of moral status. It's at the very least symbolic of human life. On the other hand, we have other ethical imperatives, namely to do something to relieve human disease and suffering in future generations. And if you don't believe that the embryo, whatever moral status has, is not the same as the moral status of a born person, then of course you could at least consider the creation of new stem cell lines and the uses of these lines in medical research. Now, how did the National Bioethics Advisory Commission deal with this, knowing that we had large elements of our society in which there were substantial disagreements precisely on this issue, the moral status of the embryo? And I bring this up as an example because I feel it deals directly with the kind of compromises, the kind of considerations that are always necessary in a liberal democracy dealing with these contested ethical issues that come up on the scientific frontier. Clearly, the sides were divided. There's nothing the National Bioethics Advisory Commission could do or say that would change that basic fact. Indeed, we had many days of testimony from religious figures, theologians, philosophers, others, scientists, and clearly it was just a major divide on this issue. We decided rather early on what the opinion of the Commission was. Namely, we thought that in thinking about our own views of the moral status of the embryo and the moral responsibilities we have for future generations, that we thought early on it would be appropriate for the government to sponsor research both in the creation of new stem cell lines and for their use in biomedical research. We came to that decision really very early. So what was our problem? Why didn't we just report this to the President? I think it took us, one meeting for this particular group of people to work that out. We were concerned about the other perspective. We were concerned that we needed to send a message to the other side that even though we disagreed with them, we had some respect for their moral integrity, we heard them, and we wanted to demonstrate if we could find a solution that would, one, support our conclusion, but also some sense and a message to the other side so that they could live more comfortably with a decision that was coming down against them. That was the idea. And we were very motivated to find such a solution because we felt as a commission, and certainly I felt as its chair, that that's how a liberal democracy works. You respect the moral integrity of those who thoughtfully come down on the other side, and you try to find some way to make it easy for them to live, for us all to live together. Well, we did find a solution which we thought might have that characteristic. You can't always find such solutions. Sometimes you just have to say, look, this is the way we came down. There'll be another day, there'll be another government, there'll be another court, there'll be another time when maybe your point of view will take hold. If you think about it for a moment, there are three ways you can produce an embryo. You can produce an embryo by cloning, using the Dolly technique. Okay? You can produce what I call a research embryo or a recruited embryo. That is, you get someone to donate sperm, you get someone to donate an ova, you get them together in a laboratory, you create the embryo, and you have an embryo. That's what you might call a research embryo or a recruited embryo. Or you can get embryos that are left over from infertility clinics that were created as part of a reproductive project, but the people who created the embryos no longer wanted them or could use them. Our view was that we should allow stem cell research to proceed, both with the creation and use of stem cell lines, but only if they came from excess embryos. That only under that condition, and only if they had the consent of those who created these embryos, could it proceed. Why did we pick that? We picked that because we said, look, here were some embryos created not to be destroyed. These were embryos created as part of a reproductive project. And now they're no longer needed. They're either going to be frozen forever or disposed of. We could make some morally useful destination, so to speak, for those embryos. Whereas by cloning or a recruited or research embryo, you are creating an embryo simply to destroy it. Right? You're creating it, and your purpose is to destroy it. So we didn't know whether that message would come across to this other side if we said, no, you have to use only excess embryos. In fact, when we made that recommendation, I would say the other side, so to speak, the side that feels that it is always wrong to destroy an embryo, some heard that message, some did not hear it. I felt okay about that. I didn't expect to convince everybody, but if some group of people who we were coming down against could nevertheless live with it and think that we at least heard them or respected them, that was a victory. So we felt very good about that. We said, all right, we'll be able to use this source, and there's plenty of embryos, incidentally, to carry on scientific research for a long time using excess embryos. But what was the reaction? What was the reaction? Well, President Clinton didn't like the recommendation number one. Those of you who may remember this, he said, well, oh, look, he said, the federal government is not going to sponsor the creation of new stem cell lines. If someone else creates them, we'll use them. But we're not going to sponsor the creation. We're not going to sponsor directly the destruction of these embryos. I understood that position from a political point of view. It's an argument he didn't want to take on at that particular time. But it wasn't very coherent. Because after all, if the government's going to use all these stem cell lines, creating a huge demand for these, and saying as long as someone else creates them, we can use them, then it seems to me it's like a don't ask, don't tell policy, to use a phrase, or it's just like trying to distinguish a hitman from the person who paid for it. In the case of that policy, we're creating the demand for these, encouraging other people to create these stem cell lines as if that can be ethically distinguished. Nevertheless, that was a policy, and I think while it wasn't ethically coherent, I certainly could understand it. As you all know, of course, that policy was made more conservative or restrictive by President Bush, who said, no, not only you can't, using federal funds, you cannot create new stem cell lines, you can only use ones existing before this date. The federal government doesn't want to be involved, even indirectly, in any more murder of embryos. That position, which I think is unstable and actually gives us as a country a worse policy, is nevertheless ethically coherent in my mind, even though I like it less than President Clinton's policy, because it says the federal government simply is not going to be involved in using money to destroy any embryos from here on. And that is a coherent policy, even though I think it's the wrong, I think it's a basically unstable policy. Nevertheless, it's sort of got some ethical coherence to it for those of you that think the policies ought to have some ethical coherence. This one has some, even though I myself much prefer the Clinton policy. Now, this has been a serious problem in other liberal democracies. Right? The other liberal democracies had to struggle with this problem. Great Britain had to struggle with this problem. Canada had to struggle with this problem. Spain, France, I mean, all the liberal democracies you would think about had to struggle with this problem. And it's quite startling to me what the differences are. So, for example, Great Britain, which I think has the most coherent of the policies, first of all, does not distinguish between public and private funding. All our policies only impact public funding. In the private sector, you do anything you want. Now think about it. In the private sector, you do anything you want. Think about what that means. What is the moral problem here? The moral problem from one side of the issue is that you're committing homicide by destroying an embryo, right? It's the murder of innocence, to put it in an exaggerated caricature form. Okay, it's the murder of innocence. Now, clearly, the state has an interest in this, has a compelling interest in the issue of homicide, right? But how we can live with a policy that somehow says in the private sector anything goes when it comes to homicide, but in the public sector only certain things go, it's very hard for me to understand. I understand the public sector has to have, may have to pass higher hurdles from time to time, since it implicates all taxpayers and citizens and so on. I think that that really is been very hard to understand. I think we could learn a lot from the way the United Kingdom has gone about it. Other countries are even more restrictive than we are, such as Germany. Others, of course, are much less restrictive than we are. The great thing about the United Kingdom policy is everything is in the public sector, and everything is open to public scrutiny, whether it's in the private or public domain. So what do we make of that? That's just an example. It's an example of how, in a liberal democracy, you can try to find what I call a sweet spot in policy, which at least reflects the fact that you take the moral integrity of people who disagree with you seriously. So what can I conclude from all this? One of the great responsibilities facing us in the 21st century is to consider the social and human reproductions of our rapidly accumulating new knowledge and the appropriate stance of public policy in this respect. Irrespective of one's views on the ultimate impact of advances in biomedical science on the evolving human condition, there seems to be a clear need for all thoughtful citizens to consider the ongoing impact of these developments on those institutions, values, and other cultural commitments that sustain our individual and common life, since it's in these areas that science and technology gain their moral relevance. Moreover, we must accomplish this task without any agreement on which moral philosophy to base our approach to this challenge. We will not, therefore, be able to arrive at a consensus solely through a process of philosophical reasoning and deliberation. We have to reach actual decisions in some other way using supplementary resources, and we have to accept the fact that we will not fully resolve some of the more contested issues. Anxiety and ethical controversy, therefore, will continue to accompany us on our journey forward. But perhaps the chief lessons are the following. First, the expressed anxieties we hear are real. Not only do scientists need to educate others about the potential and limitations of science, but scientists need to listen to the public's deeper distress and to consider the special limitations of science in dealing with issues of meaning. Second, we need to constantly build a level of respect and empathy for thoughtful points of view that are different from our own. Third, we should not confuse what we can do with what we should do. We need, therefore, to confront the issue of deciding exactly what are the ethical uses of new knowledge. Fourth, living an ethical life and setting public policies in ethically contested areas is a challenging matter, in that there is a constant and necessary need for both individuals and policymakers not only to carry out complex moral calculations, but to engage in serious social, cultural, and political negotiations. And fifth, the world of science and the world of meaning are so closely connected that realizing the potential of one requires us dealing with the other. The latter conclusion, that the world of science and the world of meaning are so closely connected, this latter conclusion implies that the world of science and the world of meaning are moving ever closer to one another, has, I believe, important implications for the university's teaching programs. It provides yet another dimension to the argument that we need to do something that lowers the barrier between the disciplines, between graduate and undergraduate education, and between professional education and the rest of the university. If we are going to have serious conversations between scientists and non-scientists that include both public policymakers and others interested in the evolution of our society, conversations that leave open the possibility that participants may change their position on, for example, the appropriate use of our new powers, they will have to share a common language and understand the hopes and aspirations of the other. University curricula can contribute to this critical requirement of contemporary citizenship by designing curricula that allow for such conversations, that are disciplined and well-informed, throughout the student's experience on campus. I currently teach seminars to both freshmen and PhD students in the general area of bioethics and research and professional ethics. The freshmen are extraordinarily interested in connecting their experience in science to the broader worlds of meaning and human understanding. Moreover, at the graduate level, where my seminar includes students in such diverse fields as astrophysics, economics, sociology, political science, and mathematics, I have watched as they inform one another through their enthusiasm to understand together what they cannot deal with apart. Both those driving the biomedical frontier ahead and other thoughtful citizens share a common concern with finding a way to deploy new knowledge in a manner that not only gives it moral content and human meaning, but relieves certain anxieties about the future. After all, what makes humans special, if not unique, is our capacity to put ourselves in the minds of others and to understand what they believe and desire. Scientists, therefore, can put themselves in the minds of non-scientists and vice versa, so that we can understand each other's needs and beliefs better. This is what ethics is all about. It remains central to our ability to adapt our narratives and belief systems to our increased understanding of the natural world. If those advancing the scientific frontier wish to reach out to the public for support, understanding, and trust, they will have to understand and directly address the anxieties that are certain to continue to characterize public concerns and influence public policy. Most importantly, however, all scientists and non-scientists engaged in thinking carefully about the future of the human condition, like artists, cannot escape the anguish and uncertainty involved in trying to create a better future, especially when the ethical questions go to the heart of what it means to be human. This is a more easily approached together than apart. We all need to remember, as difficult it is to understand who we human beings really are, it is much more difficult to grasp what we might or should become. And there's no better place to begin that journey, or indeed to continue it, than on the nation's research universities. Thank you all very much for your attention.